Welcome to the Fae Lectures 2018. This is Kara St. Louis, and this is my work, unless otherwise noted. First of all, welcome traveler and friend to the Fae Lecture, which really is both the logical outcome of the research on social engineering I've done for so long now, and the logical precursor to the lectures and the book called I, Magician. I, Magician is the third volume in the Imagination Chronicles. There are two rather important windows to open here before we begin a discussion of the Fae in earnest. One has to do with an urgency that must be applied to any discussion that helps us understand and remember ourselves again. One thing we never get is all the information, the real information, with which we can make real decisions. The single most important new variable in our lives is what is now known as the Great American Eclipse. This so-called eclipse, which was anything but a natural event, took place in the middle of August 2017. In fact, it seemed exactly like the eclipse that cut the USA in half just before the start of World War I. However, this eclipse was no eclipse. It was an E-splice, an etheric splice that re-seamed the boundary between the organic world and the artificial intelligence, inorganic hologram, together so well that it has become that much harder to tell one from the other. In fact, we really can consider it to be a line drawn in the sand. You are being asked to throw your lot in with one side or the other. It is time to choose, to take a stand for the Earth or for AI. It's really that time. And if we don't win this one, there is an even worse AI ready to settle in. And this is the one that makes the images of the Matrix reality. The Fae are aware of this. It's why they are here. When I describe the eclipse, for our purposes here, we should remark upon the fact that we are being one thing and another, between one thing and another, in an interesting, if horrifying way. And yes, the eclipse matters utterly and completely when it comes to a discussion of the Fae. Because the Fae are here now, between one thing and the next, to hand us back our magic, to try to connect in the deepest way with those who opt for Mother Earth and all things organic. The other thing I always stop and say when I give this lecture, I learned when I started trying to talk about this in Australia. It was the maiden voyage of my trying to talk about the Fae, a discussion that was so new and unique that it was very difficult to find just the right way to bring this. The thing is, I'm not going to be bringing what you may think I'm bringing. While I deeply honor the elementals, the Fae have become completely confused with just about every other magnificent creature, both of the earth and of other dimensions. What we might have been taught to refer to as fairy is not the Fae. It is an elemental being. And it would be just as much an insult to the elementals to refer to them as the Fae as it would to the Fae to confuse them with the elemental worlds. We have so much damage to undo, much of which has been brought about by entities like Disney. There is no Tinkerbell in my story either, nor are there the creatures at the bottom of your garden. Matters are infinitely more urgent than that. We have said that the time is now, the time is critical for you to make a decision. What we are saying, in essence, is it's time to step back into your birthright. We are at this critical point in time because we have been put to sleep. We have severe amnesia induced from entities outside both ourselves and within nearly unexplored inner dimensions. Because if we were to ever remember who we really are, setting things right would be immediate. None of these influences is outside our ability to dispense with, and rather easily once we understand the true situation. This is the most important thing. You are the descendants of an entity trying so hard to get your attention right now. These are beings of the first seed race called the Fae. This is the first seed race after Source, after this version of Sophia or Earth was incarnated as it is now, the Earth having had several incarnations. You are the lucky winner of an amnesia treatment, which really became a saturation event between 200 and 400 years ago, when the Draco up and vacated for the most part, and gave their human business partners the option of telling the rest of us the truth about our lives and sharing the technology or keeping it to themselves. They had the choice of instantly releasing us from our prison cloud or keeping us hostage for their own gain. Guess which one they chose? There are some remnants of the original Fae beings who became what we know as the She. They were present during the battles of Moitura. I suspect they are descendants of Lu, a character we'll meet shortly, but you should consider that on your own for a while. They are not the same thing as the original Fae anyway, and the fact of the matter is, up until a few hundred years ago, we knew all about this. There are remnants of the global civilization that existed until recently all over this planet. There have been several such civilizations, all starting with the diaspora of the Fae. So your thoughts of Cro-Magnon man and Darwinian evolution, throw them in the dustbin where they belong. Want to find the missing link? I'll show you the missing link. The one and only goal for the last few hundred years has been to make us forget. Forget what? Forget that a terrifically advanced civilization lies just a few centuries behind us. Forget that it was peopled with our ancestors, a mighty, ancient, magical race. There's your missing link. My premise was and remains that the human imagination is the translator between the morphogenic field, which is pure potential, and the material plane. And I contend that we are the only beings who can do that. This is what makes us rare and special and to be sought after indeed. That's just part of our magic. That's the part of the magic that makes us desirable to the current artificial intelligence and to other species who are unable to initiate the creation of enlivened matter. It has been said that all species possess some level of imagination. I might quibble with that, but it has also been said that none anywhere possess the sort of imagination we humans do. The Fae were here when the planet was formed. They became, as Source desired, the shepherds of the electromagnetic aspects of this creation, and thus incarnated the ley lines, among other things. We speak colloquially of the fairies as the garden's guardians of the ley lines, because they are. The confusion is that the concept of fairy is a false and misleading one. However, that's coming later. The bottom line, though, in terms of what I need you to know about yourself, is that you are the inheritors of the magic from the mightiest beings this planet has ever known. I need you to understand that you, right now, have access to that power within yourself. The Fae are not here to rescue you. They are here to rescue the planet. They are going to do that by waking you up and handing you back the keys to your power. What I will do in this conversation is take you on my journey as I discovered the Fae, and why not? It made sense to me that way. It will surely do the same for you. Finding the Fae was a direct result of my unending desire to understand what the purpose of the relentless demonic levels of social engineering are about. It had not so much to do with our numbers, for they are few, and we are perhaps billions, but with our strength. It takes everything they have and then some to keep us as collected up as we are, and we are forever leaking out of our boxes. They simply cannot contain us. Life will not be denied. So, who am I and why do you care what I have to say? I'll share my story in brief. I'm someone who was born to meet and talk about the Fae. I was born at straight up midnight in a land as close to the Four Corners as it is possible to be and still be inside a building, and that lay nestled at the side of a mountain, a guardian giant called the Sleeping Ute. The mountain itself is sacred to the Ute Indian tribe, which is just one of several tribes natural to that bit of land. I was brought into this world of waking up mixed with radical thinking by my relationship with my mother and her tragic death. That opened the door to investigation and research that eventually led to a long look into social engineering. I've learned that I've been one of many who has been the subject of a lifelong study and attempted manipulation by the military, although it isn't really pertinent to this tale. Each year, more is revealed to me. For those of you who have some relationship with the idea of a Waldorf school, let me tell you that one of the most powerful pieces of evidence of the existence of the Fae and their place in history that I have for myself as an old Waldorf teacher or Steiner teacher is that in these schools we teach history in the order of appearances. They are known as epochs. Rather than teach 12 straight years of American history, which is just brainwashing, this structure allows the children to incarnate properly. We call it the recapitulation of history. Anyway, the one year I could never figure out was first grade or class 1. It's based firmly on the fairy tales. Well, guess why? Guess what came first? The epoch of the Fae. As I said, it was the search for understanding of the ill-intended social engineering that set my feet on this path. And it was a collection of hints from different researchers, all of whom shall be properly acknowledged in this talk for their life's work, because I am a stickler for that put the puzzle together for me, up to a point. Then there came a time when pieces started falling together in ways that can only be attributed to my own clairvoyance and intuition, my relationship to the Fae, and my destiny. So what are some of the so-called areas of hard evidence? Well, we have etymology, astronomy, archaeology, anthropology, mythology. I started with etymology in the beginning, which is a well-defined and well-accepted avenue of exploration in terms of history. The history of language is a beautiful little trail of crumbs across both time and geography. I tried several times to bring the so-called hard evidence first. Time and again, I proved to myself that this is a lifeless method, completely unenlivened, and I feel more like I'm beating you with a baseball bat when I do that than when I start with a story. For this is who we are. We are storytellers, and it is in that our magic lies. There is no magic in science. Technology and magic are mutually exclusive. There are also a couple of junctures in my narrative where we run into contradiction. I always acknowledge these moments. I've realized, or certainly strongly suspect, that these contradictions have not been resolved because there's a flaw in the narrative, probably placed there deliberately by some entity. Could be the Draco, could be the so-called parents. Would have to be a very, very strong entity, and that leaves most non-humans out. But it is there, this binding or hindrance, and I will find it and undo it. Maybe through the telling of the tale this time and in this way. It is preventing me from receiving something that it's being sent to me, and so suddenly it has weight and substance and form, this block. It's now only a matter of time. These things dissolve upon discovery. As they say, the center cannot hold. So let us begin in the only way that makes sense to who we are, with the story. We shall begin with the most important part for me, which is a simple, largely unknown bardic tale called the Battle of Moytura. The story is actually about 2 battles. It is very important to understand that places and names have almost certainly shifted. The current location we now call Ireland could well not be what was known as Erin or Ireland in the distant past, or even the not so distant past, or it could be one and the same. Some say there have been many civilizations and arrivals from elsewhere. Some have the great epochs in one order and some in another. If we concede that these things may be true, for example, someone just told me that the Draco civilization concerned itself primarily with the desert. I believe it was said the Sahara Desert. Then we can feel free to park them elsewhere for now and try to unpack this gesture, this event, this esoteric geography that has intimately to do with the Fae. First, one listens to this tale with the ear of a storyteller. It's a lovely story by the fire of a winter's evening, told by a bard in bardic fashion. Beautiful. A story that works on you in the way it's meant to. Then it occurred to me to see what would happen if I looked at it literally. I was, after all, contemplating the notion of the Celtic hearth, or heart, with my colleague, sacred sites expert Maria Wheatley. I realized instantly that there was a tremendous amount of support then in the tale for the idea that the Tuath de Danann, known henceforth as the Tua, were both from off-planet, and combined with other data I had, seemed like a ripe candidate for a seed race. So let me tell you the story, especially since there are people out there listening who would be able to identify a potential binding spell on the instant, or a block or a wrong turn deliberately placed. Yes, let's hear the story first. It'll make it an hour long. I'll not make it an hour long, of course, as the bard would have done. There's much to unpack between this and the story of the second battle. It's a miracle the story has survived, really. And few people know about it. Even Maria Wheatley had not heard this story. It exists in only 2 manuscripts, one in the Old Irish and one written in the Middle Irish. There are very few manuscripts that actually come with supporting material anymore, since the Jesuits rewrote history in the 16th century to suit the purposes of the Catholic Church. But we do have the Old Irish, it seems. It is the closest thing we know to a Celtic creation myth. And in the tale of the 2 battles, it is a compendium of ancient Irish magical lore. So on with it then. They say, "'Twas a place where time began, begins, and will begin." It is a teaching tale from ancient Erin that comes with a blessing of good fortune on both the teller of the tale and the listener. So, the spell is cast. 3 times Erin put on the cloak of rocks and stone, of hills and trees. 3 times the great creator made what would be known as Erin, Ironland, or Ireland. 1,000 times 1,000 years before anyone was there, the great creator placed upon this island the Firbolg. They are known as the people of the leather bag. Here are 4 bags, by the way. They raised the land from the 4 seas. Then in this story arrive a people called the Favora, or Fomorans. They are described as living in castles beneath the sea. Some say they had 1 eye, 1 arm, and 1 leg. The truth is they had 1 eye to covet, 1 reach to grasp, and 1 step that was to invade. They held the Firbolg in slavery. The most dangerous king of the Fomorans was called Balor of the Baleful Eye. He had 2 eyes, but one was kept covered by a leather cover, a brass cover, and a lead cover. Whatever that eye beheld turned instantly to stone. The Firbolg paid a tax to the Fomorans each Samhain, each Halloween. 2/3 of their corn, 2/3 of their milk, and 2/3 of their children to become slaves. At the same time, there was another race known as the Tuath, the people of art and skill, noble and magical. They learned their power and magic in the 4 cities of instruction. In Phalius, the city of stone, in Gorius, the city of the spear, in Findius, the city of the sword, and in Murius, the city of the cauldron. The king of the Tuath was called Nuada, and they had a chief druid, or Doida, also known as the Allfather. The manuscript states that the cities were not of this world or even in its universe, but the words are a universe near to it. They sailed in special ships to Erin, and they have been described both as burning ships or as ships they burned on the shores. They arrived in the first day of May and sent their chief poet, or bard, to the bard of the Firbolg with battle terms. The Tuath wanted a fight that was simply an equal number of men until they, Firbolg, surrendered, or the Tuath were all dead. They wanted a battle of equal numbers. The second day of the battle, the Firbolg severed the king's arm off at the shoulder. On the third day, then, the Tuath, led by the Doida, the chief druid, turned the battle at last. And on the fourth day, the Firbolg sued for peace. They were given Connaught and all the Western Isles, including the Isle of Man. Now the Tuatha were the lords of Erin. Nuada had to step down as the king, though, because there was a law that said the king must be whole and unblemished. The great healer of the Tuatha made Nuada an arm of silver, but still he was not fit to rule, for metal does not supersede the perfection of humanity. A new king was chosen, a man called Bress, or Bress the Beautiful, who was half Fomoran and half Tuatha, because they thought it would be good for peace, the peace of the land. In the end, Bress was called Bress the Beautiful and Unjust. It's important to know how such a thing could come about. The land of Erin is named after a beautiful woman of that time called Eriu, and she was the mother of Bress. It was in May, a beautiful, gentle day, and she sat on the shore looking out to sea. A ship approached, just one ship with one man aboard. He had chestnut curls, a shirt of silk shot through with gold, and gold armlets on each hand. This man lay with Eriu against her will, and she wept. He was one of the 4 kings of the Fomora, Elaha. He said she would bear a son and name him Bress, and then gave her a gold ring to put on his finger. It was magic and would change size and fit only on the finger it was intended for. He said from now on all things beautiful would be compared to him. Bress was beautiful, but he had a weakness in him for terrible greed. He made an alliance with the Fomora, such that they enacted a tax on the Tuath that was worse than the one they used on the Firbolg. The heroes of the Tuath were reduced to scavengers, and the Doida himself was made to make earth fortresses at a palace that Bress would eventually use and become the High Palace of Tara. Not even a wisp of smoke escaped taxation. The Doida had a son, conceived and born in a single night, known as the Mac Ok. His mother was a woman of the Sidhe, and his mother had powers to see the future. The Mac Ok told his father, take only one form of payment for your work from Bress. Take the sprightly, black-maned, black-coated young heifer that has never borne a calf, and I will keep it safe for you out of time altogether. Things went from bad to worse under Bress. The head bard of the Tuath cursed Bress for his miserliness and lack of generosity, such that his fortunes dwindled quickly. At that time, a cure was found for Nuada, and his arm was restored completely. The son of the old healer knew that the bones of Nuada existed within the silver arm, and so took the bones out and held them to his bosom for 9 days and 9 nights. When the arm had restored itself, he cut the wisps of 9 bulrushes and cast them against it, and the arm was as good as new. The nobles knew they could now depose Bress and restore Nuada. Bress decided to take as much with him as he could when he left. He went to Eriu, who gave him the ring, which would take him to his father. She said, take with you the treasures of the Tuath and the harp of the Doida. When Bress met his father, he asked for an army to attack the Tuatha. His father refused to raise an army, but offered to hide the Doida's harp. Bress went to Balor of the Baleful Eye then to raise an army. Balor had a daughter he kept locked away in a copper tower on one of the islands, because it had been prophesied that Balor could only be killed by his own grandson. His daughter was very beautiful and had the name Enya. As is the way of things, of course, a Tuath lad called Kian, using the famous Tuath cloak of concealment, got into the tower. Enya and Kian fell in love and conceived a beautiful son, whom they called Lu. Kian spirited the boy away to his own people. He was called Lu the All-Skilled, or Lu of the Long Arm. So chanced that one day 3 women cloaked in black feathers from their heads to their heels came to Lu and handed him a spear, the spear of Gorias, and said, you and you alone are fit to wield it. Lou went to Tara, approached the gates, and the gatekeeper ran him through a series of test questions about what skills he had. He finally convinced the gatekeeper to let him in. Even Nuada was impressed, and they decided that all the men of the Tuatha, of all of them, he was the one most fit to be king. Lou summoned all the arts and crafts in Tara against the Fomorans. The Druids made the hills steeper and the rivers deeper. The head Druid, the Doida, decided to try a plan of his own and went to meet the mother of all battles, known as the Morgu. When he found the Morgu, she was washing herself in the river, and blood was flowing down her to the water. He wanted to know where the Fomora would land and where they would seek battle. She agreed to tell him in return for the blood of all the slain in the battle. Particularly, she wanted the blood of the valor and the kidneys of the leader of the Fomorans. The blood of courage and the blood of fear she wanted. The seed of fear being the kidneys, of course. She said they would land at a site where the first humans had landed. She said the battle would be at another site, also called Moitura, but this one near Sligo. She said, I am she who stands among the fallen. I am she who knows the ways of taking life. The Doida then walked to the camp of the Fomorans. He wore a kilt of cowskin. On his feet were 2 shoes made of horsehair. His wedding tackle dangled on the ground before him. His staff, one end which could kill and the other bring back to life, dragged a line in the ground. The Fomorans made him a great porridge and said, if you can eat it all, we'll let you leave. If not, we'll kill you. Well, the appetite of the Doida was legendary. They made him a porridge of 9 half cows, 100 half lambs, pig's fat, lard, and 17 barrels of meal. He ate the lot, laughing and saying, it is a wise man who understands that the crunchy bits don't spoil it. Although he was turtled like a small whale with his enormous belly waving in the air when he was done, and he fell asleep. When he awoke, he hobbled up the hill, dragging his belly, and he met a beautiful young woman. The Doida's appetites for food and women were legendary, so he stopped to talk to her. She was no ordinary young woman either, for she heaved him into the air with a druid wrestle and sunk him up to his waist in the earth. He cried, why have you removed me from my path? She said, I wish you to carry me upon your back to my father's house. He said, I cannot carry you on account of the meal I've eaten. Then she struck him in such a way that the meal left his body forcefully through both exits. Carry me, she said. I am under a magical obligation not to carry anyone unless they know my name, he said. Well, you're the Doida, she said. That's my position, not my name. His name was Fear Ben. Carry me, Fear Ben, she said. That's not the entirety of my name, said he. Well then, she said, what's the entirety of your name? Fear Ben Baruch, fool for a woman, lively for the age of him, scorned outcast, muddy laborer, paid with 1 calf, instructed in the 4 cities, lord of the 3 wheels, sage of the knowledge of waters, lord of the grove, lord of the animals, sage of the stars of heaven, all-father, crowned with staghorn, crowned with green leaves, rebirth of the world. And some names that cannot be said in words nor understood at all anymore. So he carried her, but not to the house of her father, for her father was the chief warrior of the Fomorans himself, and they coupled, and the signs of their coupling can still be seen on the ground of Erin today. And he said to her, I will go now to the battle. You will not go, she said. Indeed, I will go, he said. You will not go, she said, for I will be an oak in every pass against you. Indeed, I will go, he said, and the mark of my axe will be on every oak forever. You will not go to the battle, she said, for I will be a stone in every river crossing against you. But go he did. All this time the forces of the Fomora were gathering and stretched 5 miles down the shore of the northwest part of Ireland. Valor of the baleful eye strode amongst them like a scythe through the corn, strewing dead to the left and the right, seeking for his grandson, Lou. Lu said, "Arrow Troy, battle come a fire. Say, Fae, foe, foe." Balor said, "I recognize that voice. It's the voice of my grandson." He strode towards him, preparing to raise his baleful eye. The Morgul had given to Lu a special weapon, the only weapon that could kill Balor, a Talith of War, a hardened ball, clay composed of 5 ferocious animals, the sands of the ocean of the east, the sands of the ocean of the west. And the hard clay Talith of War was fired with the blood of heroes and the brains of kings. As Balor raised his baleful eye, Lu cast the Talith in such a way that it pierced the baleful eye right through Balor's head, and the tide of battle turned against the Fomorans. The Fomorans were vanquished there and then, and later of the battle, Lu said these words: "Until the stars of heaven can be counted, sands of the sea, blades of the grass under hoofs of horses, the flakes of snow of every storm in the history of the world, until these shall be counted, the dead of Moytura will never be counted at all." Elaha, one of the 4 kings and father of Brass, was among the slain, and the harp of the Doida could not be found. Luckily, the sword of Tara was captured, and this sword had the nature that if it were clean and unsheathed, it would answer questions, and it was able to reveal where the harp of the Doida was concealed. The Doida called the harp to himself, "Come, oak of 2 greennesses, come winter, come summer, come voice of music in all instruments." And the Doida stretched his fingers upon the strings, and he played the modes of music which call forth the seasons of the year. Now it so happened that Bress was captured, and the Tuath were in their right to put him to death. But Bress said, "Better not to kill me, for I know a secret that will give you 4 crops of grain in 1 year." "This is of no use to us," said the Doida, "for we have spring to reap, summer to mow, and the winter to rest." "But answer this question, and we shall spare your life. On what day of the year should the men of Ireland plow? On what day shall they reap? On what day shall they sow?" Bress replied, "On Tuesday. On Tuesday plow, on Tuesday sow, on Tuesday reap." His life was spared because this answer was extraordinarily clever. Then the Mac Auk came forward with 9 birds of heaven circling his head, and 9 flowers of power breathing into the locks of his hair, and he called the young black cow back out of time altogether. All the treasures stolen from the Tuath Day were returned, and all the children who'd been stolen away into slavery were returned. The creation story I've come to know of as of today is as follows. Source made an organic artificial intelligence with which to practice making things. I desperately need something else to call that, something that isn't a profound contradiction in terms for me, but I'll find it. Source has created all things, both dark and light, and all things that have to do with creation itself. The first beings here on this woman we call Earth in this incarnation were the Fae. They were shortly followed by a malevolent entity which I will now call Drach or Draco, because that is what I think right now, and I believe this story substantiates that. The invader. It is said in some of the ancient texts that the Firbolg and the Tuath spoke the same language, but the Fomorans came with a different tongue and customs. This is the story of the first artificial intelligence, the Fae, the Draco, and how they usurped AI, how they enslaved us and our magic with the help of a crossbreed race born of rape and horror and fought off by a crossbreed race born of love, friendship, and consent. I believe I can make a case that this is the landing story of the 3rd time Aaron was created, the time we're in now, and I also believe the solution to overthrowing our masters is in this story. This story is about magic with lots and lots of astronomy thrown in. The timing is here. The time to start, the starting gun, if you will, that's here too. I always say there are entities we can call the good fairies and entities we can call the bad fairies for simplicity's sake. I submit to you that there have not been many battles, but rather one long, searing, soaring battle, which started here and has continued on through the ages. The Morgul remains, wants the blood and fear of all the slain, and so forth. There is, by the way, something that's trying to come to me and has been for a while. As I said, it's in this story or it's hovering around this story. It will dissolve, the center can't hold. Now let's go back and unpack the story, at least as far as I have right now. 3 times Aaron put on the cloak of rocks and stone, of hills and trees. I believe that this would have been the 3rd incarnation of Ireland. 1,000 times 1,000 years before anyone was there, the great creator placed upon this island the Firbolg. 1,000 times 1,000 is just one of those storytelling conceits to drive the timeline into a place very, very far out of our ability to relate to. If the creation story I know now is correct, the Firbolg would have been the first organic AI straight from source. Also note the use of 4. 4 is huge in this tale and goes into the astronomy eventually, as does 9. This may solve one of the contradictions I come to later, as I'm quite certain that the Fae are capable of using entire constellations as little post-it notes, as they love to do, little hints for us to find, breadcrumbs, so to speak. The Fomorans had supposedly come from castles beneath the sea. I've wondered if this part of the tale could indicate that this happened at the time when we were leaving the Lemurian age. The Fae are liminal beings, meaning they appear in the space between one thing and the next. It's in my mind that their great migration may well have occurred during the overlap era of Mu. That they are living in the castles beneath the sea, however, may be a plant from the entity that is now the Catholic Church, the Vatican, which is the cult of Dagon, the sea god. This is a place to have a care in the story. That these are the appearance of the Draco. The Draco, I think, is pretty certain. They have the characteristic makeup of the Draco, or of a brutal and aggressive invader. However, it could also describe the cult of Dagon as we know it now, which in terms of operation is also draconian. They did hold the Firbolg in slavery. Well, AI was stolen and twisted by the Draco to suit their purposes. That's the part of the quagmire in which we find ourselves now. It's sort of like what they're doing to our RNA right now with chemtrailing, breaking the chain, and then that broken chain gets replicated. So indeed, they did hold the Firbolg in slavery. This baleful eye, so many things it could be. A weapon, the one eye we see everywhere in images now to signify that someone is part of the club. The leather cover, the brass cover, and the lead cover could be epochs, but I think that may only be partly right. I need an alchemist to help me think about that one. The Firbolg paid taxes to the Fomorans each Halloween. Halloween actually began as a celebration of the day the Fae arrived. The Tuath vanquished and contained the Firbolg, then hybrids of the Tuath and Fomorans vanquished the Fomorans. At the same time, there was another race known as Tuath Day, learning their power and magic in the 4 cities of instruction. That would be Valius, the city of stone, Gorius, the city of the spear, Findius, the city of the sword, and Murius, the city of the cauldron, which, by the way, represents past, present, and future, as well as the vocalization for magical creation. The stone, which may or may not be under the throne in the United Kingdom, the spear of destiny, the sword or Excalibur, and the cauldron. The cauldron is all about the Norns, past, present, future, and destiny. Creation, destiny, and confirmation, or solidifying of a destiny. The Doida. The manuscript states that these cities we just spoke of were not of this world or even this universe, but in a nearby universe. This could be anything, inner dimensions, or actual outer dimensions. I would lean toward an inner dimension, except for the description of the burning ships, which lead me toward a landing story. On the other hand, the Fae were the first here after Source and its pet AI, if that story is to be believed. They incarnated the electromagnetic response system in this planet with the ley lines, really just a magnetic system. So after the Draco landed as Fomorans, it's possible the Fae then emerged from an inner dimension within the planet. They certainly would not have left the planet once they arrived. They wanted a fair fight, which is certainly something I remember from my early days as being important. This thrust toward overwhelming and conquering, outnumbering and outgunning. This is fairly new. Turning from politics and material leadership, the Doida took over the battle on the third day, and that's when the battle turned. Here we have magic superseding politics. On the fourth day, the Firbolg sued for peace and were given Connaught and all the Western Isles, including the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man, or the Manx culture, is a place where the residents were said to be rescued from the taxes imposed by Manannan, a god of the sea, by St. Patrick, who actually, in my view, did not exist. The church did take over the legends of the Tuath Day. Now the Tuath Day at this point were the lords of Erin. Nuada had to step down as king, though, because there was a law that said the king must be whole and unblemished, and he had a metal arm. No matter how you slice it, this is an artificial arm made of metal. Other than that, I have not unpacked this one. When Bress was born, Elaha, the king who was his sire, came across the sea wearing gold, and that is the first time we see gold in this story. The Fomora or Draco have 4 kings. I remember a head poet of the Firbolg and 1 king of the Tuath Day. Are there any magical beings with the Fomora or Draco, or just monarchs? The story does not say what Bress received in return for his alliance with the Fomorans. By now we're talking about a hybrid, it seems, between the Fomora and Tuath Day, as much as pure Fae. The Doida had a son conceived and born in a single night known as the Mac Och, and his mother was a she. The she would be half Tuath and half Fomoran as well. At the time when Nuada was restored to the throne, his arm was restored by the son of a healer. The son of the old healer knew that the bones of Nuada existed within the silver arm, and so took the bones out and held them to his bosom for 9 days and 9 nights. When the arm had restored itself, he cast the wisps of 9 bulrushes against it, and the arm was as good as new. The nobles knew they could now depose Bress and restore Nuada. 9, 9, and 9, of course, the ever-present bulrushes too. 9, 9, and 9 being basically a lunar month. Balor had a daughter too. He kept her locked away in a copper tower. Here we see copper for the first time, and now we have brass, gold, silver, and copper, as well as lead and leather. When Lu appeared on the scene, even Nuada was impressed, and they decided that of all the men of the Tuath Day, he was the one most fit to be king. He came across 3 women cloaked in black feathers from their heads to their heels, who handed him a spear and said, "You and you alone are fit to wield it. Here are the Norns representing destiny, past, present, and future. The keeper of things like the cauldron and apparently a spear of Boreas. They could only be pure Tuath or Fae, or perhaps goddesses." Again, the move from the king, the ruler, to magic happens every time there's a battle, and the Doida went to see the Morgu to try to establish some sort of heads up in the coming battle. Note the characteristics of the Morgu. She wants blood that is associated with courage, honor, and fear, spilt on the battleground where one would find nothing but adrenaline. Does this sound familiar? We certainly see that now. She particularly wants the blood of the chief warrior of the Fomorans, and that would, in my view, would have been a Draco. I think we need to ask why. The Morgu is also known as the Morrigan, a goddess of sovereignty, reminiscent of the future figure of Kali. She is one of the manifestations of the 3 goddesses. She said, "I am she who stands among the fallen. I am she who knows the ways of taking life." Interesting that we have a female whose specialty and exclusive knowledge is the ways of taking life, when the Fae are the creators. I'm still unpacking that one. And when the Fomorans had fed the Doida, he fell asleep. The question is, since he remarked on the crunchy bits in the meal, is this the first time that he's eaten meat? And is it the meat that made him fall asleep? My reading of the story here eventually comes to this. Lu said, "Arrow Troy, battle come a fire, say Fae, foe, foe." My reading of the story here sees Lu of the long arm invoking the Fae in battle against the foe. The Morgu had given to Lu this special weapon. Yes? There's some analysis of this bit, which includes astronomy. The ball, the Talaf, seems to be the moon. Some versions of the story talk about 3 times 9 Fomorans who stood behind Balor and were slain by this ball, which could represent the moon. The 27 could loosely represent the lunar cycle if Balor stands for the onslaught of the false Apollonian mystique, Apollo the sun god, and Lu of the long arm representing, in fact, Orion with his arm high in the sky. For me, if we can take the astronomy seriously here, we might date this battle, or even understand the convergence of stars in the heavens when the Draco are vulnerable to defeat. I would need a real astronomer to unpack that as well. Bress, once captured, offered to teach the people how to get 4 crops of grain in 1 year. I do think that given what we are up against in this century, and the last, in terms of the havoc wreaked upon nature, the earth, and ourselves by forcing the maximization of crop and commodity and animal yields to the point where the very earth herself is shrieking in agony, we might have a look at this so-called gift that the Doida and the Tuath turned down, understanding the health of things, and the balance of things, and the rhythm of things. The humans left behind by the Draco did not turn it down, but rather used that technology and continued to try to wring the earth unto death, together to produce, produce, produce. I found this bit to be very interesting. Then the Mac-Ot came forward with 9 birds of heaven circling his head and 9 flowers of power breathing into the locks of his hair, and he called the young black cow back out of time altogether. All the treasures stolen from the Tuath Day were returned, and all the children who had been stolen away into slavery were returned. Again, this bit needs to be unpacked, as I think there's a very large clue here as to when and how to restore this planet. How far back this all goes. The Tuath Day, otherwise known as the Fae, and their descendants of mixed blood, known as the She, inhabited this island for time out of mind, really. How far back it goes is constantly being altered by discovery and by intuition. Some say 300 million years ago, this earth came into being. Just today I saw that in Israel, a settlement clearly built by what is known as Homo erectus, that's us, has been unearthed and dated at 500,000 years old. So it does seem that an archaeology and anthropology captured by the social engineering of the 20th century is being forced to admit that not everything is 4,000 years old or dates back to 4000 BC. You'll notice this date now that I've said it. Much has been made of the physical appearance of the Tuath Day. Physically outstanding, tall with red hair and fair skin, it's been noted that the rarest combination of hair and eyes now is red hair and green eyes. Periodically, I notice that some gathering is being held for redheads around the world, and I cannot help but wonder, given the obsession of the current overlords with genes and gutting us magically, if these are events to avoid. Avoid exposing your direct lineage like that, which appears to be an expressing itself utterly in this lifetime. They continue to live, principally, according to the legend in the Boyne Valley, where the goddess Boann would have held sway over the Boyne River, with their capital of being Tara. I'd like to finish the tale as I've come to understand it, before moving on to the next topic, which is the goddesses and the feminine gesture of the Fae and their creation. Ireland was, as you must know, never overrun by the Roman armies. The Druids were a force to be reckoned with. The Romans, an offshoot of the Draconian infiltration. The Fae may have vanquished the Fomorans or Draco, but the Draco never left entirely. That was simply a description of game on, so to speak. 'Twas not until the Catholic Church or the Vatican, having buried their cult of Dagon, or the fish and sea king, under the guise of Christianity, turned their attention toward Ireland that we had a problem. However, we cannot consider the Fae to be vanquished. There was a moment in time, a real twilight time, and in-between time, when they retreated back into the earth, and I believe that decision was mutual. The Fae wedded themselves to the earth in order to protect her, and the earth took them into herself. It was a mutual moment. There is a clue as to when that happened. Two bits of information which are important to understand just when and how the Vatican took over and Erin became Ireland. First of all, the Fae used a bit of magic all the time, having to do with hiding themselves in a mist. The cloak of invisibility, it is sometimes called. It's how the lad got into the Copper Tower and lay with the daughter of Balor. And in my view, the most powerful spell out there is called the Faith Fiata. It is true irony that the first word is pronounced faith, also known as the cry of the deer, which is another attachment to the head druid or the All-Father. Catholic histories, Christian Western modern histories, will describe a time in which the Druids were conquered by St. Patrick, using a mist to hide himself, and a prayer called St. Patrick's breastplate, or the Lorica, or the rune of St. Patrick. This is none other than the mighty spell of the Druids, or Tuath Day, the Faith Fiata, or the cry of the deer. At Tara today, in this fateful hour, I place all heaven with its power, and the sun with its brightness, the snow with its whiteness, and the fire with all the strength it hath, and the lightning with its rapid wrath, and the winds with their swiftness along the path, and the sea with its deepness, and the rocks with their steepness, and the earth with its starkness, all these I place, by God's almighty help and grace, between myself and the powers of darkness. It is my view that the Faith Fiata was a witness to the Fae retreating into the earth, as they and the earth wished and needed, probably from when they had come anyway, and where they still are. For me, it seems certain that whoever or whatever came into Erin at that time was enough of a threat to the earth to require this incorporation of the Fae back into her. They are mentioned now in Ireland as the old people who were driven out by the church, but we also know them as the high people, the noble people, or the gentle folk. In retrospect, meaning based on the entirety of the evidence I've collected, we can say that the Fae were a feminine culture. They were creation itself here on the planet by permission and empowerment of Source. Creation and birth are by definition womanly. The timeline that leads me to believe this, which we will cover over the next bit of lecture, is this. Eriu, as the namesake of Ireland and all the other goddesses that came to be known there as Boann and others who inhabited the rivers. Boann was the river Boyne, for example, the goddess that was bridged and usurped at least nominally by the Catholic Church. The collective spirit impulses, other than the All-Father of the Doida, the chief druid, of the way in which the Tuath or descendants of the Fae conducted their lives, their comings and goings, the Druidic culture, which went from strength to strength until the Julian Caesars began to have some luck in killing them all off, beginning in Gaul. When the Doida released the natural order of the seasons with his music, he would have freed the natural power of the rivers and the land as well. The Morgu was what we would certainly see as a malevolent goddess if we take the vision of her washing blood into the rivers and demanding blood from battle. She was known supposedly as Morgana, the Morgan. In the end, some called her Morgan Le Fay. However, we always have to be careful that we understand that the Fae then and now do not operate under the manufactured constraints of a code of human behavior, and so we know them as amoral, just as we should consider the elementals as amoral. They have no use at all for a code of behavior that matches ours. I'm not trying to introduce the principle of relativism here, though. The goddesses of ancient Erin had not just to do with the waters, but also with the land and with the succession of sovereignty. The Norns certainly must be collected up into this idea of goddesses. They dealt with matters of destiny and sovereignty, the past, the present, and the future, and were clearly the keepers of the cauldron. The cauldron represents the larynx in the end. The Norns would spit into it, and vocalizations are how the Fae and ultimately the Druids and Tuath did create this world as they went. Using the ley lines, which we will get to, and the power of the frequency of their voices. One of the reasons, by the way, that the predator tries so very hard to vanquish and snuff out oral histories. One of the most powerful remaining is the beta, which is recited aloud. I assume the rumor that the UN intends to move to India has something to do with snuffing out that magic. The names anywhere, many, Matcha, Bronwyn, Dana, Boann, Bodkatha, Celtic goddess of war, mother aspects of the triple goddess. She symbolizes life, enlightenment, wisdom, and inspiration. Sister of Matcha, the Morrigan, and Anu. The name of this goddess means boiling, battle raven, and scald crow. A mother goddess and part of the trio for which Ireland was named, including Eriu and Fotia, or Fotla Bab's cauldron boiled with the ever-producing mixture that produced all life. It would have been Bodkatha who spoke to Lu and handed him the spear of destiny. Eriu, then, in this sort of scenario, would also have been a Norn. Backing into this tale of the Battle of Moytura seems to allow us to name the Norns, which is something I personally have not come across. Bridget is quite important. Had she not been of supreme importance, then the Vatican would not have stolen her away. First of all, let us consider the visual evidence of St. Bridget's cross. This would be the 4 again, which I could spin, I suppose, if I wanted to. The 4 leather bags of creation, the 4 cities of instruction, the 4 seasons restored by the Doitus harp. There will be another piece to the 4 when we consider a very important bit of astronomical evidence, which I believe now to be a signpost in the heavens for us, rather than a place of origin, which is of the power of the Fae, the 4 cardinal directions. The importance of the number 4 is endless. Bridget was the daughter of Boann, a river goddess and goddess of cattle. There was a young heifer released, one who had not borne calves, kept out of time altogether by the Tuath healer, and returned to the Doida after the second battle of Moytura. That healer was Angus Mac Och. You may remember his name. And he was in truth the son of the Doida and the goddess Boann. Likely, this heifer released as Boann released as a creative and reproductive power on the earth. The history we can trace a couple of different ways. There's the etymology of place names, things, celebrations, and so forth that lead us back to the Fae. There's also the history of the all-out assault on the feminine aspects of this world, beginning with the usurpation of Bridget, which became Saint Bridget, and whose day, the 2nd of February, is celebrated in distinctly different ways. Some of us still celebrate Imbolc. Some of us celebrate Candlemas. Some, the Christian St. Bridget's Day, and even here in the USA, we have the ghastly Groundhog's Day, which is actually quite pagan if you think about it. There are ways in which the Fae have made themselves known over the centuries since the Catholics overran Erin, and almost all of that has to do with feminine apparitions. You'll notice I'm quite deliberately avoiding the word female, as that also is an invention of the Vatican and their maritime law that reduces us all to herds and commodities. The word feminine is better if sometimes it jars the ear a bit and seems slightly improper. Additionally, there are ways in which magic has always carried the hint of the word Fae in various languages around the world. Feticieras means sorceress. The word fairy, unfortunately, as men of ill will were able to turn that into Tinkerbell or some twisted aspect of what the Fae really are and do. They're always associated with a wand, which is a diminution of the sword or the spear they brought with them, and of course that cauldron. We end up with stories like the Sword and the Stone and the battle between the monarchical or legal in Arthur, who established the law, and the magic in Morgana. Merlin becomes a character to override the magic and place the monarch at the head of things, yes, by magical decree, but magic is then seen as evil, a strange and twisted retelling of a very important tale. This we can unpack another time. Women in white are important to all of this, the Dames Blanches of France, the Lady of the Lake. We can trace linguistically many incidences when women ruled a place or governed a place. In Frisia, for example, the women or femme ruled and became known as the Magdeburg, the women of the castle. From here we see a strange twist in the character of Mary Magdalene. And then all feminine apparitions become the Mother Mary in a gambit used for a patriarchal transition, absolutely brought on by the Vatican. Until that time, my research indicates that there was no patriarchy. How was all this then shoved down our collective throats? Via a rewriting of history ordered by Pope Gregory in the 16th century, which was carried out by Jesuits and enforced at the point of a sword in conquest and in the Inquisition. Some interesting and important bits to note. Even in ancient Egypt, according to the work of Stephen Mailer, the word pharaoh was grossly misunderstood, and in fact, that's a Greco-Roman word for the male head of the household. In fact, the per-ah means the high house or the women's house. The woman was always the para, or pharaoh as we know it today. Males such as Ramses were consorts to the para, and only consorts. Descent in Egypt was always matrilineal. The Battle of the Boyne was supposedly the reenactment of a landing used masonically to overtake the English-speaking world by enacting a ritual on the Boyne River against Boann. Read about that in Ireland, Land of the Pharaohs, which could be read as Ireland, Land of the Per-ah, actually, the women, the matriarchy, the Fae, the high house of the women. In fact, that just happened again, with the appearance of Kali on the side of the Empire State Building, and the recreation of both the Battle of the Boyne and the original arrival of the Fae. But this time was enacted by CERN in preparation for the Great American Eclipse. The art was made by a person called Louis Hoyos. Psi meaning particle physics, Oi meaning a boat to convey along a stream or river, and OS meaning operating system. And we understand that that call for artists from CERN a few years ago now, a Masonic ritual, an AI ritual. Anyway, we have lots of etymology to look at further along. But I would like to have a look at some of the astronomy. This is one spot where we get confused, and certainly I did for a while. There's a symbol older than time, really. The oldest known example of it, to my current knowledge anyway, is 40,000 years ago. What we know as a swastika carved into a rock. This symbol's ancient, and it's one of the most positive symbols that ever existed, no matter what anyone of the second half of the 20th century believes. Remember, please, that the swastika looks an awful lot like the cross of St. Bridget. In fact, this symbol is one of those breadcrumbs left us by the Fae, and the one I think is intentional is as follows. The Big Dipper constellation sits in front of Ursa Major. As we go through the seasonal cycle of a year, the Dipper appears to revolve around the pole star. Right now that's Polaris, and as it goes around, because of the shape of the Dipper, it forms a swastika. This, combined with the avalanche of cultural and archaeological evidence of the fact of the swastika, leads one to see a very strong connection. Now, what does that have to do with the Fae? The bottom left corner of the bowl of the Dipper is a planet called Vecta. Nearby to that constellation is the planet Draco, actually. I used to think that this meant the Fae came from Vecta, but I think now, knowing they were the first non-artificial intelligent beings here post-source, that does not really line up with coming from a planet. The ancient manuscripts say they don't even come from this universe. But this is a being powerful enough to enact this sort of clue for us to find for sure. And by the way, if you try to research the word Vecta, you come up with some sort of East European word for call girl. Considering the smearing of the feminine since Rome, this does not surprise me, and simply adds to the evidence that I am correct in my view. What I might have called the astronomy of this story, I believe can be boiled down to some hints. One, I think there's a recipe buried in the Battle of Moytura for when and where to throw off the yoke. These are dates or times for all of the above that we can come to via astronomy. Second, I think the Fae left a big post-it note in the sky for us to find and verify that they were and are here. The trail now leads to inner dimensions both within us and within the earth itself with the aid of the esoteric study of water. Hence, Boan and Morgu in the river are huge parts of this story. There is something to understand and remember about the Fae. It's extraordinarily important. It has to do with when they come, where they arrive, how to find them, and how they do their work. The Fae are fundamentally and completely a liminal being. Liminal simply means relating to a transitional or initial stage of a process, or occupying a position at or on both sides of a boundary or a threshold. The Fae in all their forms are not creatures of absolutes. They existed before the world was in its current form and helped to shape it into the place we all live today. They warden places where natural change occurs in the form of evolving life forms, spiritual birth, and the reclamation of our forgotten works by the powerful processes of nature. Due to this inner nature, they are all without exception liminal, and it is most visible in their preferred places and times. The Fae are best contacted during the solstices and equinoxes, dusk and dawn, true noon and midnight, the new moon, the first and last quarter, and the full moon. While I can say that Maria Wheatley, my colleague, has been approached in this way by corporeal entities she certainly names as Fae, all of my contact to date, with the exception of one dream vision, comes through clear intuitive clairvoyance. These times are neither one time of day or the other, neither one season or another. Their preference is also visible in those places that are best to meet them. Crossroads that have to do with the number 4, graveyards, the reflection in a pool, and the shores of a sea. If there's a place that is a border, it is a place that holds power for the Fae. If it's a natural border, so much the better. We need to re-understand our sun, our planet, us on it, and the relationship between our planet, ourselves, and the sun to understand ley lines. Only a being who was the first being after Source in relationship to this incarnation of the Earth would have some idea about the raw magnetic requirements here. To create, any being who inhabits the planet would simply need to understand the magic involved, which has to do with frequency. Crystals have also been laid here to heat the planet and vibrate in the ways they're supposed to. However, if we know some things about crystals at the moment, it is that they convey information and are programmable if it's wanted. Any crystal conveys information of some kind, whether it's heat or healing or what have you. I cannot tell you how the ley lines were put down, only that the Fae did this at the very inception of the truly physical post-Atlantean planet. It may well have been that they brought the stuff from which the ley lines were made, which would have been dispersed as water or air in earlier eras, such as Lemuria. It may be that the physical manifestation of the ley lines during previous times would have eluded us, dispersed energy that needed to be gathered into this system of power lines. I do not quite have that answer yet. It may also be that these are energetic pieces of the morphogenic field gathered and channeled here on Earth. I tend to think that this must be the case. The Fae are the guardians of such and have always been. I do speak about the myths surrounding so-called fairy lines and how humans can run afoul of the energies there, not in my view because the Fae are malicious, but rather because there is energy there manifesting in ways we no longer understand. This can feel violent to us or frightening. If we stick our finger in a light socket, we don't get a shock because the electricity is angry with us or wishes us harm. We get a shock because it's a power that's not compatible with us at that moment. A little electricity does not bother, a lot bothers a lot. The Germans refer to the ley lines as Kreuzen. In the colloquial, this means both childbirth and circulation, which makes much sense if the ley lines are utterly creative. They are, under any circumstances, way-showing lines. In that, they match the Fae themselves, who are way-showers, in a truly cosmic sense. The Fae are closely associated with iron, although the myth is that iron keeps fairies away. The real story is that all indigenous peoples paint clay or tattoo woad and such on their bodies, and in their tribal dances, the body painting helps them to become little dynamos as they spin. Their magnetic power increases substantially as they become their own little mini suns. But my point is that iron is magnetism, iron in the ground and iron in our blood. Fe is the symbol of iron on the periodic table of elements. They are also deeply associated with the magic of blacksmithing and metalworking. It's been posited, and I agree with this, that the iron in our blood is part of how our memory works. The iron in our blood acts in the same way that the rust on cellophane tape used to record electromagnetic signals in the old cassette tape industry. This is one big reason strontium is being dropped on us from on high. It's a bone marrow seeker, and so attacks not just our immune response, but our memory ability, and making us forget is job one. The Druids certainly knew, as do many entities still connected with true magic, that the ley lines interact with the latitude lines to form a sort of grid. The right frequency or tone applied properly and in the right place can raise a hyperbolic tower of sound or a Pythagorean tower. One of the most powerful places this happens is Alais in France, where 24 or 26 ley lines converge to a point. This point is just a few miles from CERN, and I assume the energy is used by them or being destroyed by them. Quite recently, a man visiting Tibet was treated to observation of Tibetan monks using the power of sound to levitate huge stone. And for those who prefer, scientists have demonstrated that sound has the power to move small objects, although experiments with heavier objects have been met with limited success. In 1939, a Swedish doctor named Jarl was brought to a Tibetan monastery to treat a High Lama. He stayed for a long time and developed an intimate friendship with the Tibetans. One day, the monks took him to a high cliff where they were constructing a rock wall. About 250 meters from a tall cliff, there lay a large stone. 19 musical instruments were set in an arc, precisely 63 meters from the stone. 13 drums of different sizes accompanied 6 trumpets, each of which was 3 meters in length. The monks began playing the small drums, then the rest of the instruments chimed in. All the monks were chanting a prayer, and after 4 minutes, the stone began to sway. Suddenly it took off in the direction of the cliff, and after 3 minutes of ascent, it landed on the cliff. The monks were able to move 5 or 6 stones an hour using this method. The specific nature of the instruments, combined with angles and distances involved, of course, indicate advanced knowledge of vibrational physics. I would say that it indicates an organic, natural knowledge, something we all know and can use when we acknowledge this. The origines of various places and times, such as those in Australia, knew of the ley lines but called them song lines, which makes sense since we sing things into creation. Song lines are on or in the earth, but for them, they are also in the stars. They can cross many countries. Walking one backwards is actually considered to be sacrilege. Of course, the ley lines are intimately connected to astronomy and rises and falls in power accumulations that have to do with planetary alignments and such. And how does the earth and her people take advantage of or react to this ebb and flow from the heavens? One would hazard to guess that it has something to do with our magnetic nature, whether it's the piezoelectric effect due to our salinity or the iron in our blood. The sun itself imparts information to us via our skin. Of course, most civilizations have their own terminology for this sort of thing. In China, as well as in Britain, we speak of dragon lines. In Britain and Europe, we also have Mary lines. There are everywhere spirit paths and so-called fairy paths. Frankly, the clues to the Fae existence corporeally on this planet are endless. They come at the between times, and they do come. They ebb and flow like the water, like the effects of the planets. Certainly, the corruption of ley energy by entities such as CERN would bring the Fae to our recognition again. The corruption of the air and water would bring them, despite the fact that these are the provinces of the elementals. The diminishing of the reach of the sun would bring them, and messages of desperation must be coming from the trees and all other forms of beings which form a network into the earth. In what ways are the ley lines being damaged right now? Ever since roads crossed leys, and more importantly, the dragon line earth currents were cut through, which the Chinese describe as amputated, the energy system has been affected. The building of roads have cut the dragon lines. Clearly, you have groups who imposed their wills on the system and abused it. Himmler set all the concentration camps, for example, on the red and white energy currents. This is where they got the color for the Nazi flag. Then you can feed into those lines so much pain and fear, and the energy reflects that. Placing power objects on these currents after a sacrifice holds the energy like an anchor. Sound also acts as an anchor, especially if there are standing stones on the line. Tall buildings stab ley lines. The New World Order used negative global grid systems for the placement of prisons and orphanages, using ley lines for energy farming, just as they use sports stadiums and such. Much of the most compelling evidence that beings of a truly higher order were active on this planet until quite recently have to do with archaeological and anthropological evidence. Scientists throw up their hands and we scratch our heads at the idea that amazing building works exist, and if we are to believe what we've been taught, we as humans are not capable of erecting them. Cultural customs cross boundaries in seemingly inexplicable ways. Unless, of course, one considers the idea that there was a recent global civilization whose only differences had to do with environment. If one dispenses with the Darwinian impossibilities and accepts that sophisticated human beings have been on this planet for eons and eons, then there's no longer any need to wonder. In terms of archaeological and anthropological evidence, we have many angles to research. Yes, there are communities built that require far more intelligence than the supposed development of our skills would have been at the time. There are actual civilizations which have been erased from the history books. There are uncanny cultural similarities, which range from the farthest north to the farthest south. All these things point to an intelligent, sophisticated, and ancient global civilization. Yes, there was a catastrophe which caused a global flood. We think 10,000 years ago, but remember, history was altered in the 16th century, and the accepted dating techniques are rubbish. One of the most noteworthy considerations is that while often building techniques display engineering, we don't have a grasp of any more, much more is made from using the natural, magical, and highly advanced resources already here and already in place. Really, it is such propaganda to teach us that the little metal prison cells we've built for ourselves are advanced. Let's just look at a couple of things as examples of how buried and twisted things can get when one is under the thumb of the great amnesia machine. I have a couple of archaeological examples, cultural examples, civilizations that were not only erased from our memories, but a couple that were made to go to war against each other, which is normal for the predator. And remember, old does not mean primitive. One really good example is the history of Tartaria that I learned about through Sylvia Ivanova in her New Earth series, and the example of the megaliths of St. Petersburg. All of the palaces in St. Petersburg are so over-engineered that they have no relationship at all with the technology that was available at the time they were built. Neither does the architecture and style of the palaces match any contemporary technology. St. Petersburg was the final capital of the last bit of an ancient land known forever called Tartaria. Scientists today claim intricate buildings and megaliths were built by a people using tools softer than the stone of the buildings or the sites. Knowledge of how these things were actually done is being recovered. And frankly, these are being blown away as fast as we can find them in the so-called Middle East wars and the Ukrainian Holocaust and so forth. Much was lost in Iraq, for example. It's all about keeping us from remembering. To consider the over-engineered shafts and often megalithic tunnels that are all over the world and are of uniform design. These look like they are parts of technical installations, and they are found all over the world. Sites include Egypt, the Caucasus, Sydney, Central America, South America. To consider, There are numerous historic sites all over the world which have been selectively covered with mud or clay or some other strange thing that could not have arrived there in any natural way. To consider the possible artificial origin of some or perhaps all of the deserts on the planet, my colleague Shane Bells has said to me that the Sahara was an original home base of the Draco on this planet. Despite being likely the most reliable oral history left to us, some have come to wonder if parts of the Vedic texts have been lost or changed, as dates cannot be agreed upon by Vedic scholars in India. It is the same old trick, introducing new text, new dates, changing language, and in this way knowledge is lost. A diaspora based in Ireland, in the place we now know it to be, would have begun in Scotland or Wales. After all, one crosses the Irish Channel by means of a ferry, doesn't one? The obvious candidates for a group who may have been Fae or even She are the Picts. They actually did not call themselves Picts. No one knows what they called themselves. And any settlement led by the Druids would be one to keep an eye on. So much has been wiped from our sight and our minds in the last few hundred years. The social engineering of the 20th century meant that within 1 or 2 generations, the entire narrative could be hijacked and changed just by virtue of removing tiny children from their homes and burying them in lies in the schools. Sylvia Ivanova speaks of that land called Tartaria. Hundreds of medieval maps depict a great landmass, a country in Asia called Tartaria. You can look for yourself. As we said previously, it's very important to understand that places and names have almost certainly shifted. What we now call Ireland could well not be what was written about or spoken of as Erin or Ireland in the distant past, or even the not so distant past. Some say there have been many civilizations and arrivals from elsewhere. Some have the great epochs in one order and some in another, as I've said. If we can see that these things are true, then we can note these things and feel free to park them elsewhere and try to unpack this. It may be that while we are unpacking this, some of the terms or supposed timeline, which can never be nailed down for sure, may feel a bit unsatisfactory, but I promise that we should soldier on. My experience with this is that it does unpack itself, and it has so very many layers that it can seem endless. The fact is, the land of Tartaria, which was one of not the biggest country of modern times, is not even mentioned in the textbooks. This is a really solid example of how impossible it is for us to think clearly about anything spatial in our realm anymore. This country lay north of India and Tibet, and it lay on the maps as late as 1766. As the controlled demolition of freedom and knowledge was advancing rapidly, knowledge of Tartaria disappeared. Inhabitants of this phenomenally large land were made to abandon values and customs handed down by their ancestors culturally. At the same time, insurgent monarchies were installed all over Europe. I can recommend the work of Anatoly Fomenko regarding the false chronology and the so-called monarchies and kingdoms, many of which were created, put into place, and supported by the Vatican. We know this as the Reformation, but we don't understand it as it really was. The weapons of Reformation were in fact the Reformation and plus the Inquisition. This is how the false history was forced down our throats. Propaganda pamphlets at the time depicted Tartars as bloodthirsty cannibals. Once the parasites had buried the reputation of the Tartars, they started a new country in the westernmost part of Tartaria and called it the Russian Empire. The Tartarian kings had been in the line of the Hyperborean heritage. The invading monarchy was called Romanov, and they embarked on the utter destruction of the Hyperborean legacy. We have been tricked into believing we are in a reality that is completely false. Leaving that for a while, let's look at India, a country which still lays supposedly right before our eyes, with claims being made that all is as it has always been there. Many of us think that despite being conquered and practically brought to its knees, the culture of India remains the closest live example of the original culture. The oral tradition of the Vedas is powerful. However, before we go on, consider this quote from Lord Macaulay's address to British Parliament in February of 1832. "I have traveled across the length and breadth of India, and I have not seen one person who is a beggar, who is a thief. Such wealth I have seen in this country, such high moral values, such people of high caliber, that I do not think we could ever conquer this country, unless we break the very backbone of this nation, which is her spiritual and cultural heritage, and therefore I propose that we replace her old and ancient education system, her culture. For if Indians think that all that is English is good and greater than their own, they will lose their self-esteem, their native culture, and they will become what we want them, a truly dominated nation." This goal was accomplished through crimes against humanity, and to date the parties responsible for this have not been held accountable. In fact, these days are thought of fondly, wistfully in the UK as days of past glory. After near genocide, the British tried to destroy any historic records, but could not do much because the histories are oral there. Hence, they invented a written history, one of their own devising. The gesture is always, "We found people who don't know who they were until we arrived and told them who they were." The same description can be found regarding South American cultures as the colonials arrived to destroy in the last few centuries. These stories remind me of the description of the Fomorans: one eye to convert, one arm to grasp, one leg to trample. Egyptian oral histories speak of the advanced global civilization to which they all belonged. Why are we assuming that there were very uneducated, untrained people who were taught higher skills by an advanced civilization? I don't assume that at all. What I assume is that there was a global, highly advanced civilization, each part skilled according to their own environment, until just a few hundred years ago. We do know that raiders came from elsewhere and took advantage of those here, probably just post-disaster, to farm us for their own purposes. You know, even a highly advanced civilization could be taken advantage of by an entity bringing a method utterly foreign to them for such. Just like the culture and civilization of Tartaria, we can look at India and be awestruck. The caves of Ellora are a good place to start. Here's a question. Did the Indians as we know them today build these ancient caves? No, of course not. Clairvoyants say there are many places of power which have been hidden from those who cannot responsibly interact with them. Are they hidden from us because we've been drowning in amnesia and social engineering? Or are they hidden from the human business associates of the vacating Dracos? History's always being rewritten. In recent years, the government of India and several state governments have decided to revise the history books, particularly relative to the ancient period, bringing up recent data that calls into question the Aryan invasion and the many theories that have arisen from it. Over the past few decades, numerous archaeological finds have been made throughout India, considerably widening the civilization of the region, in North India for sure, and uncovering its continuity through time, thus rendering the Aryan invasion idea obsolete. It is often the case, no matter where you dig, that the older the temple or structure, the more advanced the technology. In fact, there is evidence that up until a few hundred years ago, there were people who could just manifest things with their thoughts. There is another culture whose origins appear to be solely bound up with India, also reliant on a 100% oral tradition, which is kept secret from the world at large and very, very identified with the blacksmithing trade that bears examination here. It is the Rom, or Romani people. They were kicked out of India for blacksmithing, which is in many circles seen as magic, as sorcery. Here we're right up against iron again. Music has been one of the prime contributions of the Rom. They sing about an ancient homeland that they yearn for but cannot remember. Such a truly human thing that is. The music of flamenco, by the way, is an offshoot of their folk music. Based on the etymology of their language, their diaspora could have looked like this. Supposedly, the language base is Sanskrit, hence of Indian origin. Genetics demonstrate a distinct connection between the Rom and the present-day warrior classes of India. The language reflects bits of dialect from several Indian regions, and so seems to suggest that the original group was assembled in some way for some purpose. The primary diaspora from India would have occurred around 900 AD, when Islam was spreading west and east. Some think this was a warrior caste collected up and called the Rajput, sent from their leaders to drive Muslims from their borders. Gajet, the term for a non-Rom, literally means civilian or non-military person. The layers of foreign words borrowed from others leave a virtual map of their travels. They originally moved in a straight line across the coast of the Caspian Sea, passed through Persian linguistic territory, pushed across the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains to the north coast of the Greek Byzantine Empire. Supposedly, it was here that they took up the profession of metalworking and blacksmithing. When Constantinople fell, they were carried on the crest of the wave up into Europe at about AD 1300. They went to the Balkans first, to Moldavia. These areas were backward in the skills that the Rom possessed, especially metalworking skills. They became so essential to the economy that laws were passed making the Rom property. Some escaped and continued west. Their arrival sent shockwaves through Central Europe as they were dark-skinned and spoke a language no one had heard before. But by pretending to be Christian pilgrims, they survived. Suddenly, groups of Rom began to arrive in Europe, not only with titles, but with imperial letters giving them safe conduct. It was at this time that stories started to circulate that some of the Rom had practiced paganism in Egypt, and so these had been sentenced to roam the world in penance. This smacks of the church rewriting history, in my view. Rome oral tradition maintains that they are the ones who brought knowledge of how to manufacture muskets and cannon. By the middle of the 16th century, about the time history was being rewritten by the Jesuits, Europe had turned on these people. Laws were passed to keep them out of cities and towns and even away from the wells and pumps. They turned to stealing to survive, as they could own no land. Modern scholars of Rome history will say that the Romani have an excellent education system based on oral tradition and not on the written word. They need only to be able to sign their name and know how to read a road sign, so to speak. But they teach their children to think on their feet. Children and the institution of the family have always been of paramount importance. Rome children were bounty hunted for some time at 45 cents a child, which may explain why they then turned around and stole local children, assuming they did that. Here we have that fairies stealing the babies bit. The gypsies, as they are known now, travel. At least many of them do. And so do the Aborigines of Australia. This makes me think again of dream lines, song lines, and ley lines. They say that the Aborigines of Australia are still in dream time and so will not survive. I imagine that will not be the case with the gypsies. And just as a sidebar, by the way, the word artifact was originally an anatomical term meaning artificial conditions caused by an operation. It began being used in archaeology around 1875. When it comes to evidence of the Fae, perhaps the most compelling and potentially the driest is the etymology. This was brought to my attention by an engineer living in Germany, who's in his late 80s by now. His name is Erhard Landmann. He has a mind like John Nash, you know, the scientist from A Beautiful Mind. He saw patterns everywhere. And in the end, he realized we were talking about something that was present all over the planet in every culture. The evidence can be PHE, FE, FEY, FAE, FAY, and even PHAY, although I've only seen that once. The thing about Landmann's work, though, is that the etymological evidence, say of a place name, was often combined with evidence of a feminine apparition or figure in the same spot. The Fae were and are most definitely a matriarchal feminine being or gesture or entity. Landmann was looking for an entity to blame for the disappearance of people everywhere. His overall theories were fueled when he discovered the evidence of the Fae, and he determined that all the so-called extraterrestrial abductions, that is, the unexplained disappearances and reappearances, were conducted by his version of the Fae. This is not a theory I subscribe to. In a nutshell, he believed that the Fae came from a planet called Vecta in the constellation Ursa Major, as we've already discussed. You can still watch him on YouTube if you speak German, but I will warn you, his lectures are those of an engineer, dry as paste. Still, it's a brilliant resource as long as you have a clearly determined for yourself what you think space actually is. I think that's crucial, and you'll see why as we go along. At any rate, he suspected that the Fae were responsible for all the alien abductions we hear about, and that kept his interest in the research quite high. Some people have picked up on the Fae just for that reason. It bolsters their idea of creating a sensation from alien abduction, and suddenly everyone is talking about the Fae. They have no proof, mind you, so that's going nowhere. Just because there's a saying, away with the fairies, does not mean the Fae are responsible for reports of abductions. In fact, it's the military who's responsible for almost all of those things. However, Landman did some fantastic work on the etymology and the images of women that are associated. Because of the marriage of these two things, it can be extraordinarily difficult to separate the language from the land and its spirit. The true meanings of holidays are a case in point. Therefore, I present Landman's work as a piece. Inevitably, the words and the road maps of the words lead us into the goddess culture. The goddess culture lacks a fair amount of specific flavor unless we met and contemplated what I consider to be the most important bardic tale, the Battle of Moytura, which we have considered at length. Then we're in the so-called mythology, and we are deeply into magic, because the bards were on a level with the druids for a very, very long time. And so the story itself can be a bit elusive. It can be very difficult to unpack a thing that is so tightly woven together, like the entirety of the AI trance. There are lots of things I'm still unpacking, which is why I will undoubtedly have to put one of these out every year. Now, how does etymology work, and what can we know based on those tracks in time? Well, simply put, etymology concerns itself with the origin of words. In the end, when we rediscover magic, this will become terrifically important to us. For now, it leads us to evidence of the Fae in all cultures everywhere through the spelling of words. The letters that create spells we call words, and the incidence of words containing some form of the name Fae mean that the Fae are being mentioned all the time worldwide. Borrowed words create a trail of breadcrumbs. Most cultures have their own etymological dictionary. The Urban Dictionary is just such. These link up with the anthropology and history and linguistics, all the recognized sciences deeply supported by etymology. Through words, we can trace history and melding of cultures and changes in attitudes, belief systems, religious constraints, political constraints. I mean, there's no straitjacket more secure than that of political correctness, which has to do with what words we are allowed to use, which, among other things, is just a lovely way to remove the inherent magic in our spoken word, the dance of sentence construction, and so forth. Erhard Landman pointed up lots of language evidence coupled with some sort of profound feminine aspect, almost always at the place where X marks the spot. If you want to get into this in great detail, you can. I've got a book out that I put together with Maria Wheatley called Guardians of Blood and Fire, The Search for the Celtic Heart. The evidence is in French, German, Spanish, English, and so forth. I'd like to lay out a series of facts that appear to have no connection at first sight. For thousands of years, there have been fairy tales, tales of fairies, and they're so deeply ingrained into different languages that the word fairy tale is equated with tales about fairies, as in French, the contes de fées, or in English, as in the fairy tales. Not only are there a lot of place names which are derived from the fairy, as in Feyenoord in Holland, Saas-Fee in Switzerland, or Feendorf, Feenau, Saas-Fee, Bergfee, Urfee, all of those in Germany. There are a huge number of words that have been received into everyday language for everyday use, which is true for all languages without us realizing at first glance that they were dealing with the term fairy. Urfee is located near a town called Magdeburg, the city of the woman, or Mary. Ur means original, and Fey, well, Fey means Fey. In most languages, the word for fairy is equated with the word for sorcerer or sorceress. As we've said in Portuguese, the feiticeiro is the wizard and the feiticeira is the sorceress, both of which mean fairy, and these always carry a magic wand. That is a rod, a metal rod, with which they can cause electrical forces to conjure mighty things, like in the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty, where a wicked fairy can put the entire workforce of a castle in sleep, and thus override their natural defenses. According to Landman, the same has been reported thousands of times by people who claim to have been abducted by UFOs. As I've said, I do not subscribe to that theory, mostly because I think it's a misinterpretation of the words space and universe. And remember the 4 items of the Fae: a cauldron, a spear, a sword, and a stone. Are we speaking of the spear when we say wand? Linguistically, this finds wonderful proof in the fact that the English word saint equates to sankt in German, which means to sink or to come down or to descend. The Tuatha, after all, landed in fiery craft. Thus the word sancta, to sink or descend there, became later, after the confusion of tongues, converted to holy in its allegedly Latin version. So the phrase all sancta, which originally meant the fairies from space came down from the planet Fae, all sanctus, was rendered into the alleged Latin term Feast of All Saints. The phrase Cepheus comes from the planet Fae, today also equated with, designates a star constellation or the alleged Greek god of sleep, or Phaeus, from the planet Fae in the Ural, or the name of the old city. Ephesus, the god of darted to the planet Fae, do offer such references to us. But could not interpretation like comes from the planet Fae means simply comes from the Fae? The and all, which could be the morphogenic field or the original creation story, which stated that the Fae come from the next universe and were the first after source, or indeed. Now, let us briefly turn to the phrase Fae, F-E-E, by using linguistic analysis, but limit ourselves to German, English, and French in this endeavor. Whoever could protect themselves from the wand of the fairies was gefeit, or invulnerable. The word feign thus means to be protected from the Fae. The English feign, F-E-I-G-N, denotes deceptive, hypocritical in what the dark fairies effected with their wands. The Portuguese feiticeiro, of course, comes from feiticeiro, which is the deceptive fairy, since with her wand she could do not so much conjure up things as to command powerfully devastating forces with her spell. The expression feint, F-E-I-N-T, means the deception, and the deception underlines this. Fetch is a ghostly doppelganger. Feet stands for heroism, and fear uses the same Fae root, and R supposedly denotes the craft. According to Landman, the AR is the spacecraft of the Fae. The word fetish notes that the fear of deceiving the fairy has led to great veneration. 'Tis certainly an unhealthy obsession, a fetish. The old tales of all nations about fairies tell us now and again that the fairies, or some evil fairies, do kidnap little children, or sometimes replace them with ugly, nasty children. Here, I think we want to remember the tales of the gypsies and the bounty on the heads of the gypsies. The German language has coined the term Wechselbalg for this phenomenon, known as changeling in English and changeling in French. This event must have happened countless times throughout the centuries and across the world. Well, there are thousands of reports of abductions by UFOs where exactly the same thing happens. Fetuses are taken from pregnant women, or a male abductee would be forced into intercourse with the so-called blonde fairies from a spacecraft. This prompted me to explore the meaning of the word fetus, similarly and correctly spelled in a number of languages, and I could not have been more surprised. In addition to the old German word mentioned above, Täuschen, which means to pretend or deceive, which often gets mentioned in connection with fairies, there is the word Tussen, to swap, or in Middle High German, Tuschen, again to swap. A fetus, therefore, alludes to an exchange, possibly the interchanging of unborn children by fairies. My view is that this sort of thing is far more likely to be conducted by the military or those involved in MK Ultra programs. Nevertheless, one notes the similarities of the words Täuschen, Täuschen, Tuschen, meaning to replace and cover up. In Norwegian, fairies and elves are known as alfar, those that travel far into space. Alfar or ins alfaren. The word changeling is also rendered in other forms such as Wechselkind or Wieseling, all means space in German, by the way. Let us now turn to the evil fairies who eventually seized power globally sometime between the 9th and 13th centuries, which also coincides with the great diaspora of the Rome. This would coincide completely with the period of time which has been called into serious question in terms of the standard chronology. It is anything before the 9th century, which cannot be verified, and anything prior to the 16th century, which cannot be depended upon as true at all. This would, to some extent, explain the dismissive behavior of officials, governments, politicians, and religious dignitaries of our time. Where do the terms serfdom and feudal rule originate from, and what do they impart? In most languages, the word is more correctly rendered as feudal instead of feudal. Fae od al means the planet Fae in the galaxy, Od in the all or space and universe. Or it could be the Fae from the galaxy Od in all. Since the planet Fecta is located within the Big Dipper or Plough, then if we want to accept that the Fae are from a planet in our galaxy, which is not what the Irish tales say, the galaxy of Od would be our own Milky Way galaxy. All of the above could be true, and still the Fae could simply have left a clear hint, a breadcrumb, by virtue of the name of that planet and the Dipper's yearly formation of a swastika. F-E-O-F-F, feof in English denotes vassal. Fae also denotes genetic material or wage payment, fee. Feud is the dispute, the feud. The revolt of the serfs against the evil lords thus led to the feud, to battle. Serfdom, in French, sauvage, which comes very close to a meaning implying slavery, was therefore introduced by the evil beings of the galaxy Od from the planet Fae. My research does not support this. However, the Draco tendency to invert everything and turn it on its head makes this interesting because the corruption of a tale can tell us something too. Here are some interesting words in connection with the term fairy. So, Felix does not only stand for the Latin word the lucky one, but L-I-X, better L-I-C-H, stands for the planet's surface. Fae Lich is thus the surface of the planet Fae, perhaps, or perhaps the light of the Fae. Fecundo today means fruitful in many languages, but Kundo, or Kundo with a C, is the ambassador, the herald, the angel in Anglo-Saxon, the announcer or messenger from the planet Fae. In many fairy tales, fairies, goblins, and gnomes were addressed. Fetiro, the cousin. A fight with the fairies was Fehtan, F-E-H-T-A-N, or which means fencing. The German term for the sport fencing, Fechten. The word vehemently, vehemens or fehemens, the Fae leads them into the otherworldly all, stands for energetic, vigorous, or stormy during the launch process of the spaceship on its voyage home to the otherworldly universe. And last but not least, we must not omit the word phenomenon, Fe-no-men, an appearance from the planet Fae, as in men from the planet Fae. The Russian name and surname Fyodor, as well as Phoenix from the ashes, are indicative of the planet Fae in the galaxy. Fae-nish, Fae tilts toward the planet Fae, since most UFOs tend to tilt sideways during the first phase of liftoff. Let us not forget that the the all, can absolutely mean inner dimensions as well. Irish mythology is teeming with clues. There are the Fae Argus, the harsh fairy, whose spacecraft is the Con Fae Argus, the Con All. In this line of thinking, the Kun All is the wedge-shaped spacecraft. And there's this phrase, Fae Argus Fiod Flioda, the Arg, or harsh or bad or dark fairy, flees to the planet Fae in the galaxy Od. Is it flee, or is it flee to, or is it just flee? Obviously, the departure and return of fairies from space was always celebrated, and that not just on Halloween. The word festival attests to this fact. It reads, Be stib all. The fairy stibbed on into space, sputtering, aufstieben, originally meaning kicking or to fly up. Likewise, fete, F-E-T-E, comes from the fairies. The home of the fairies is supposedly Avalon. It's the owl, AU, or the watery plains in the space above. Spacecraft are called vet or phet, P-H-E-T, or vehiculum in ancient texts. In the Oralinda book, it's reported that women, in Frisian femna, in English femme, young woman, in French femme, ruled the state. In this capacity, they came to be known as Burgmagden, maids of the castle. City names such as Magdeburg or Magdala, near Weimar in Germany, testify to the Magdala fairy Fae connection. Magdala means the handmaid of the all, or the universe. The Bible carries many mentions of Magdalena, the maid beyond in space, and religious scholars found that this does not necessarily denote the woman who was placed as an acquaintance of Jesus in the drama of the New Testament. Hartmann von der Au writes of the sorceress Fae Morgan, which broken down into a sentence suggests the Fae in Urgan, the fairy goes to Ur. In Spain, Portugal, and along the French Atlantic coast, they have the story of the White Ladies, Dames Blanches, Damas Blancas. For centuries, more precisely, since the takeover of power by the Catholic Church, these apparitions have been interpreted as the appearance of Mother Mary in order to control these unusual events. In French mythology, Dames Blanches means literally white women. Fae in Ur, F-E-I-I-N-U-R, Fae in Ur, means simply Fae in the morphogenic field, perhaps, not outer space. Ur meaning the field and all meaning the universe or space, but not necessarily outer space. I would like to say here and now that I'm now sure this idea that the Fae were physically from Fecta is not true in the material sense. I do believe that this is simply another post-it note, a marker that the Fae left, that they were here, that they existed. The connection with Fecta and its place in the Big Dipper and trail that leads to the swastika in the sky. This is a giant trail marker, a greeting, if you will, from the Fae. Last but not least, we must talk about the word Fae itself, F followed by A-E together, which was a letter until recently, and was called ash. The world tree, that is to say Yggdrasil, was an ash. Our F is the sound of fire, fire being the element of Genesis. This letter, the combined AE or ash, has not been gone from our daily lives for very long. It's always important to bear in mind that the letters are the ingredients of our spellcasting. Letters spell words, after all. In the same way that I feel certain that there are layers of information and even instruction in the tale, The Battle of Moytura, Colin Wilson wrote of another tale, The Song of Taliesin. What had once seemed nonsense to Wilson and all other medieval scholars, suddenly, in a moment of clarity, clearly became a series of riddles set forth by the author. In the end, Wilson concluded that the answer to these riddles were the letter names of the ancient Druidic alphabet. What was now called the Battle of the Trees proved to be a way, perhaps, of describing struggle between priesthoods in Celtic Britain for control of the national learning. Because the word Fae means ash, this cannot be but crucial to the tale in some way. However, we must always note that even the top of the layer of discovery under the immediate face value meeting with something like this leads deeper and deeper as we unpack it. Often the answer is simply to let things settle down and down and down into our inner dimensions. Nevertheless, the word tree means learning in all Celtic languages. The Fae of the Druids, all deeply associated with trees, and therefore learning. These are master teachers and also masters at protecting their form of learning from those who would take it and destroy it. In fact, the more I investigate this line of ancestry, the more it seems obvious that those who had secreted away their learning are those who remain free, even if they are marginalized. Perhaps this gives new meaning to the term 5%. In fact, according to Wilson, the Druidic alphabet was a jealously guarded secret in Gaul and in Britain. Indeed, its 18 letter names were kept secret for 1,000 years, indicating it must have been a secret worth keeping. Turns out, though, that the Battle of the Trees hid an even earlier, more secret alphabet. This alphabet was attached to wild trees, including the alder, and was a sacred calendar as well. The tree consonants standing for the months in which they were characteristic, and the vowels standing for the stations of the sun. It is a calendar that can be proved by virtue of the festal uses of trees from Palestine to Ireland and associated with the worship of the triple goddess. Trees and fae are inextricably woven together, and even more sacred and esoteric than an oral language would be a secret language of the trees, an education system equal to none. We know that a forest has a mother tree, communicating with trees hundreds of miles away. A language indeed. Fae, the ash, the Norns, the goddesses Brigid, Boann, and Eriu, the Morgu, the high druid, the cry of the deer, song, music, and the power of creation. This is who we are as descendants of the Fae. Were we to really remember this, it would be difficult to get us to kowtow to a petroleum engine or a vaccine or a fast food hamburger, all weapons of artificial intelligence. We would be free in an instant, as would our Earth.